Hello, my name is Matthew Marquit and welcome to this fourth video in the Beginner's Guide to Substance Painter. In this particular video, I want to talk about layers and masks. Now, layers and masks are the bread and butter of Photoshop, which I have said in a previous video is probably something you already know, especially if you're jumping into texturing, into Painter and whatever. But even if you don't know it, it's also the bread and butter of Substance Painter itself. There's a lot of fun and cool tools that you can use within these, and so let's kind of cover how that works. So what are some of the basics of layers? Well, we have our layers panel over here. I can add a new layer by clicking this new layer button. So now we have two layers, right? I can take a layer and paint on it. If I was to say try to paint this layer now, of course, whatever layer you have selected is the one that you paint on. But if I was to paint white on white, that'd be silly. So how about let's just change this to red. So I can paint some red on this first one here, right? And then maybe we can paint on the second one here a different color. So maybe I'll choose like a greenish or something, some neon green, and we'll paint that, some complementary color scheme. Awesome, right? So there you go. Beautiful, right? You're painting awesome textures already. Anyways, but as we can see here, the order matters. So this top one, the red one, you can see in the thumbnail there is above the green one. You can drag it underneath and now it is below it. So that's how layers work in the stack. You also have your opacity. So I can drop the opacity of it so that it kind of becomes somewhat transparent. I can see underneath it. And you also have your layer blend. So you can do things like a multiply, right? Or we can do like a screen or an overlay or lots of other types of blends, okay? What's even cool too is they have some blends that even Photoshop doesn't have, including things like a normal map combine, where you can actually do a blend in which normal maps combine. That's actually really awesome that it has that. But whatever, you can see right here, just a ton of different stuff, ton of different options. We'll just leave that on normal. You can turn the layers on and off by clicking those buttons. Okay, now you can also do some organization within layers by basically double clicking on them and naming them. So this one is the green one, so we'll type in green. This one here's the red, so maybe we just type in red, right? Being really creative. But obviously the idea is you want to be able to figure out when you have tons and tons of layers where everything is. So that is what you would want to do, name the layers. Now you can also organize by making folders. Now these are called groups in Photoshop, but they work just the same. I think folders makes more sense anyways, being a Windows guy, but we can come in here and maybe I can double click on the folder also, and we can call this like, say, you know, brushes or whatever. So I'll call that brushes. I can click on both of these by holding down Control and then move them over and dump them into the folder. Now you can minimize the folder by clicking that. You can even hide the entire folder and everything in it all at once by pushing that. You can even drop the opacity as a whole of the folder and the layer blend as a whole. Okay? So those are your basic concepts of layers, and this is, like I said, universal throughout to any program that really does this kind of stuff. All right, so let's kind of go through each of these things. I'm going to skip this first part here because it's a little complex, and we'll go through the other ones and get back to that in a moment. But the first one, other than that, is the Add Effect button. So if you push the Add Effect button up here, you can add sorts of things. Now, you can't add it if you don't have something selected, so you want something selected that's relevant. If you have two layers selected like I do there, it won't work. If I just have one layer selected, now I can come in here and actually add some of this stuff. But to be honest with you, I don't push this button because you can simply right-click and find them down here, right? So we can add our generators or paint layers, fill layers, levels, and filters easily the same way by doing that. Now the next button is masks. That's also complex, and I'll talk about that in a moment, so we'll skip that too. This button here is the edit layer button, which is basically just hotkeys. I mean, you can cut a layer and paste a layer and, kind of, copy layers, duplicate them, all sorts of remove them, group them. But honestly, like, this stuff is, something that if you just remember the hotkeys, you never have to push this button either. I've already showed you this. That's the new layer button. This one is your fill layer. So fill layers, you click on, and they will just dump in. And honestly, I don't use fill layers a lot because what I do is I actually just drag something in. So if I was to say drag this, this right here, and actually, what's funny is if you have a fill layer selected and you click on a material, it will automatically update it with a material. But to be fair, that's a lot of extra steps when you can literally just drag, say, a fill layer and dump it in like this, and I turn this other stuff off, and now you see that fill layer is in there. So there's a couple ways of doing it. I suppose you can just click on fill layer and then find something down here, or even drag it onto the material section, and that will update it. So even if I don't want this one anymore, I'd rather replace it with this crazy one here, we can come over here and put over the material mode, and you'll see that it'll update that over there. Okay, so you can kind of see all these different layer blends and how they're blending with each other. So we're getting kind of normal maps from the other ones that are kind of superseding some of the other stuff, which kind of can give you a cool effect if that's what you're going for. But if you're not, of course, we'll just shut that off and we'll just see our plain fill layer. Okay. Then we can come over and we'll see after fill layers that you can add a smart material, which is the same as clicking on smart materials and dragging them into here into the layer section, just the same as a fill layer. But you can also click on this and then it will give you an option to select any of them here. You can even search for them using that bar if you want. I find that not as intuitive though. Okay, folder button, and then of course the delete button. So you can, in a lot of these things you can delete, like I can just have this selected and just hit the delete on my keyboard and have that disappear too. So that's what all those buttons do. So let's kind of go back to the more complex things that I was just referring to a moment ago. Okay, and I want to kind of show you some other cool stuff too. So let's kind of get rid of all this nonsense here. And I'm going to drag in, let's say machinery here, right? So the idea behind this, now this is a smart layer now, or a smart material. Now smart materials, as I mentioned in the other video, are just basically a bunch of stuff within a folder, right? So you do have your metal base, which is basically in this case your material or your fill layers. See a little paint bucket, so we know that's a little fill layer there, right? So this fill layer can be changed. So the color is yellow, so I can come in here and change it to a darker color, or you know maybe like we do this kind of light green. Okay, so we have that effect going on, so you can change that. You can change any of these, turn these on and off and get different effects. This up here is the rust, so if I shut this off, you can kind of even backwards engineer it here. That's the rust. They have the dust layer, which is, you kind of see some damage that's just on the tops of it, and you'll see that when I shut that off, it'll turn off. And then the dirt layer, which kind of fills in the crevices and just adds this very faint kind of effect to it, and it is dropped in opacity, so if I actually increase it, you'll see it more. So you kind of play with that, but that's kind of how these fill layers, or not fill layers, these smart materials work anyways. You can kind of go in and easily change any of these settings. So they do give you some defaults, but you're more than welcome to change them. And now you can see we've created something completely different than the original machinery here, even though we're using all the same layers, right? Because they do have things that you can affect, and you can affect all the stuff down here too. Right, so if you want it to not be as shiny, right, so right now we can see how shiny this is. We can come over to the metallic area and we can slide it. Okay, so we can move the slider. Right, so if it's all the way to 0 on the metallic, you get a little bit of reflection. It's not like a mirror, but if you go 100%, we go to metallic over here, you're pretty much almost getting like this mirror effect, right? But this is in combination to the roughness. If the roughness is set to 0, it is a pure mirror, right? With the metallic at 100, or basically 1, and roughness at 0, you get a pure mirror. Right, but if you do roughness higher, what you're going to do is it's going to get, if you go all the way to the top, you really don't get much of a reflection at all, or really any at all, right? Because the surface is more rough, so it doesn't reflect. If some's like a perfect surface, the light bounces off the same angle it came towards, or like direction, not the same exact angle, but at a 45 or 9 degree. I don't know the science behind it. Stop quoting me on it. Anyways, the point is the way light bounces off of glass and a perfect surface or a mirror is why you get a reflection versus a rough surface, which you don't get a reflection. So that's basically all you're controlling here, right? So you can see how I move the slider around. I'm changing that, okay? And then the metallic, if you set it all the way to 1, that's more metal. If you go all the way down to 0, it's more plastic, okay? And you can kind of see that difference, right? So that's kind of how those things work, even though that's a little bit outside the scope of the particular lesson. But I did want to show you some of this stuff, especially if you didn't know about it. Okay, and then part of the reason why I also talked about it is down here you can even, if you see up here, you see things like the color, the metal, the roughness, whatever. I put an emissive on there even though there's no emissive actually working on it. But you can shut these channels off and then paint just on one or the other. So even when you shut them off too, you'll notice that all of it shuts off. But if I just want to paint just on the color, I can come in here, I can grab a layer that I can paint on, so I need to actually create a new layer. So we'll create a new layer and we'll go back up to the top here, and then I can paint on that layer with this much brighter green that I already have from the previous brush, right? But if I want to paint, the color and the height or something like that, right? And actually I did have the height on when I switched it back over, but let's just shut all the rest of these off. If I want to paint the height and then actually have it pop, I can move the slider over here, come in and paint, and you'll see that it actually pops and goes above the surface. If I go in the negative, if I go in the negative, it will go below the surface, right? So you'll kind of get an indent, right? Which is kind of cool. And the reason why I show you this is because this is just a different way of doing this up here too. Up here you can either paint directly on the metallic, the roughness, the normal map, the height map, emissive, and so on. Okay, so you can either choose to paint on multiple maps here, or just one by basically selecting them all, or just paint on one by coming up here and changing these. Okay. So those are a couple of different ways to do that. And then, of course, now that we've covered pretty much everything that I wanted to talk about in the top portion, right? And actually, you know what? I did forget real quick before we move on. Let me show really fast. So this machinery one, I'm actually going to hide again, and we'll go back to this, see, where is that? More complex one. Is it a smart material or is it a material? It's a material. So we'll drag it in here. So this one here, it's a little bit more complex, but the reason is you'll actually see a little bit better what I'm about to talk about. So when I talked about fill layers, right, we talked about some of the other stuff, but some of the things I forgot to mention is the properties of the fill layers over here, which are important because you can change the way it projects. So there's two different types of projections. So let's just say you're putting something on, you want the grain of the wood to follow the object, or you want it to follow the UVs. This is all dependent on which projection you choose. So projection is set to UV projection here, but you can change it to triplanar projection, and then you'll see that everything kind of goes straight. So this would be one where you want it like the grain of the wood to follow the object or something. So you can see how that affects the object. So that will change the way, of course, it's being rendered onto the surface, because you see what it does is updates it in material, makes it curved this way, but of course makes it look straight here, which is pretty awesome, because if you try to paint it that manually, that would have been a pain in the butt to try to figure out, like to try to lose the distortion, make it look right. So I think that's really awesome that they have that. You can also repeat it in different ways. So you have some filtering here. I'm not going to play with that, but depending on the texture, you can also change it so that it repeats or just only shows up once. So repeat is what it's set at and grayed out as. I can't do anything other than repeat, but you could in some cases with some of the materials set it to only show once, which to me is kind of silly, but you could do that. You can change the scale of it, how many times it repeats, right? So you can repeat it more or less by moving the UV scale here. If you change the lock, you can actually have the UV scale stretch in one way versus the other. If you really want to do that, not sure why you would, but you click that lock, now you can move them independent. You can also offset a little bit, so if it's kind of close to what you want, but it's just a hair off, you can move the offset, right? And we can even type numbers in if we want, instead of just moving the sliders, right? And you can offset it in two different directions, right? Left and right and up and down. You can even rotate the texture, right? So we can go over here in rotation, or we just leave it at 0. And the hardness, basically the hardness is kind of like whether it tiles or not. If you actually have it at 0 or 1, or 5, like in this case, it was actually right down the middle at 0.5. But you'll actually see that the way it blends when it transitions between different parts, this is actually very relevant with the hardness. If you set it to 100% or 1 in this case, you'll actually get it just cut off. So when the texture ends, it ends, and you don't see this blend. But if you want it to blend, you'll actually pull this down all the way to 0 and now have a fade between it, which makes it so it doesn't look like it tiles. But on textures like this or materials like this that are pretty complex with very distinct lines, it doesn't work very well. So you tend to want to be right in the middle, as the default of this was, which was 0.5. Right? But that's just because the projection and the tiling and all that other stuff I've been screwing around with, and so that's why it looks odd. So if I was to say change this back to UV, you'll actually see that we don't get that issue anymore. So you do have to be mindful of how those settings, when you change them, will change the way the end result looks in your fill layer. Okay, so that's pretty much all of those. So now we've covered the fill layers, we've talked about the different properties. And so now we can get into masks, and masks are pretty fun to deal with. Let me actually, and I think I have this, I actually wrote it down so I can remember. I had a leather fine aged over leather weathered. So I'm going to go over here to my smart materials, and I'm going to switch over to the body. Okay, and actually I'm just going to shut the head off because it's a little distracting right now. But what we're going to do is I'm going to take those two that I was just talking about. So there's different ones. So there's a leather weathered. So I'm going to drag that one in, and that will be on the bottom. And then I had, I believe, let me double check again because I forgot already, leather fine aged. So we'll look that up, and this one I believe is your leather fine aged. Okay, so we'll do that. It's thinking a little bit, so let's try this again. And we'll put it right there. Okay, so we have this over the top of this. So there's two different ones. Now the reason why I did this was because I put a smart mask on it. Now you can theoretically just use a mask as a mask typically works, right? By clicking on a mask up here. And this works like, this is going to work for the entirety of this folder, or you can just actually separate an individual layer. And actually a lot of these layers already have masks. But what we could do is click on the mask button, and you can add a white mask, a black mask. You can use a bitmap, like an image for a mask if you already got one. And you can use a mask with color selection, which ding, 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 this is what you want to do when you're doing ID colors, right? So when we have a material ID like this one, we can actually do this. So we can go like mask with a color selection. And then what you're going to get is the ID mask over here, and it's going to mask certain things based on the color. So now we want to actually choose the color itself. So let's see, where are we? Color, right here, we pick color. And you can just come in here and go, okay, which one? So it looks like the arms and the legs and the body are like separate, and you can either pick it over here one way or the other. So now we can mask it so that in our material ID, the red is the only thing that's showing it, and then now we have the other, which is the weathered one underneath, showing just on the arms because we use that. So that's how you would do a material ID mask, okay? So I kind of went into the complex one first, but I just saw that and I was reminded of it, and I just wanted to make sure I didn't forget about that because, you know, the material ID masks are actually pretty important. Now, like I said, the normal basic ones are just like your add white, add black. If you add black, that's one of those ones where it makes it invisible. And then if you want, whatever brush, so let's just say I come in with a brush, I use any brush that I want here, and I just paint in with white, which will be the default color here, whatever the opposite of whatever your mask is, and I can paint in, right, that previous material. So I can go in there and paint in that material, right, doing that effect. So there's two different ways of thinking about it. If you do a black mask, you can paint in where you want it, or if you invert it, which is pretty easy, you just click on the mask. You see, click on the folder icon or the mask, but you click on the mask and you hit I, that will invert it. It has to put a levels on it, but it inverts it, and so now whatever was the selection before is the opposite, and now you have what's going on with this one is now we'd have to switch this to a black brush, right? And so instead of a white brush, we'd have to scroll to where the, let's see, where are we? Color here. So the grayscale uniform color, we switch it to black, and now I can paint out wherever, you know, I want. So you can see that's how that works. So it's kind of the opposite effect, right? So, and you can remove or clear a mask. So if you're like, you can also hit X to switch between the colors. So I should have just done that before, but it's just like Photoshop when you swap between your foreground, background. Same thing here, you hit X and you can switch between black and white. So I can paint in white, just hit X, go back in black, and so on. Just keep doing that. Non-destructive, that's how these masks work. And then if you want to just clear it completely, you can right click and clear it so that it just erases it, so it goes back to the default. So if you chose a white mask, it'll go back to a white mask. If you chose a black mask, go to black mask. And then you can just delete it all together by right clicking and going, instead of clear, let's make sure, let's try this again. So we click on that and we do remove mask, bam, right there. So there's your remove mask. So that's kind of how you can add the mask. So those are the simple ones. Of course, like I said, the white and black, and the mask with color selection, which will be your ID one. Okay, and you also have your clear, remove, and so on, right? So you have your different type of masks. But the fun masks happen to be the smart masks, which, just like, as I mentioned with the smart materials, it's just kind of like a whole bunch of different filters and things going on. So what's really cool, and once again, I believe, let me check this again. So I did edges scratched. So let's come over here and we'll do the edges scratched filter, and we'll put that onto this one right here. And what's really cool about this one, and this actually looks like I inverted it maybe, right? So the thing's inverted. So if we actually just click on our icon here and we hit Control I, we invert it, or not Control I, hello, just I. This is what I wanted. And now you can see that this mask, which is probably cool, is what it does in the edges. It looks like it's worn down to that other one underneath, to that weathered leather that isn't so shiny, right? Which is on the bottom. Okay, and this one's on the top, so the majority of it's still that shiny leather, but maybe the edges are starting to get beat up. That's what's really awesome about these smart masks, is that they have all sorts of cool features, so you can kind of highlight just certain areas. Now keep in mind that you have to bake your textures and have a lot of these things like your curvature map and position maps and things in order for these filters to work properly, but once you have those in there, of course, they'll work fine. So you can even go in with any of these smart masks, like this one has levels and a sharpen and all that other stuff. You can come in here and play with the sharpen and see how that changes the mask, right? That's kind of a nice effect too, where it makes it look a little bit older in more places, but just is a little bit stronger on the edges with the sharpen filter. Right, and then we can come down here with, and this is a generator, so we can play with the generator, we can randomize it, you know, we can play with the wear level, right, and all sorts of crazy stuff like that. So that's the great thing. I'm not going to get into every one of them, but basically the idea is you just drag them on, you go to each one, you play with the properties, you move sliders around, you get what you want. And that's just really awesome. We can get these awesome effects doing that. So and keep in mind too, by the way, that you can do effects in multiple places at once. And actually, I should say you can actually add multiple ones of these. So I have, in this case, one of these filters, but you can add another filter on top and so on, as our mask, I should say, smart mask. So you can actually have a smart mask over top of a smart mask over top of a smart mask and so on. So you can have that effect. But really what I want to do, let me show you real quick to give you an idea of another thing that's important to know. The problem with the smart masks are they can cannot be painted on. So if you were to say kind of come over there and go to paint on it, you couldn't do that. And let me give you an example. This is what I did with my blood layer here on this axe. Okay, so if we actually scroll to the, I want to make sure I'm on the blade, and I go over to my blood layer, you see right here, what I had to do was I had to add a paint layer, because when I originally put on the mask, okay, so this particular mask was set, it put blood everywhere, and I didn't really want it everywhere. Like I didn't want it all on the other sides or whatever. I kind of wanted to have it just in certain places. So while the smart mask did a good job of giving me an effect that I wanted to paint further on it. And so in order to do that, you can see right here, I can turn on the paint layer, and you basically can paint over and add or take away to this mask just by doing that. And really, all you have to do in order to do that is over the mask, if I just right click and add paint, you'll see the same effect. So if I want to paint anything out, right, remember black is to paint out, so you can come over here and paint out. So like I said, you cannot affect those layers or those masks alone, so you have to add a paint layer over the top of them, so you can come in there and just paint those out. And then if you want, and I know what I did here when I take my brushes, so let's come over here and find brushes and then choose, I believe I chose something like mold or something like that. Where are you? Mold right here. So then you come in and you can paint in. I had a red brush. This is kind of a black brush here, but what in this case is painting out. So I hit X and I switch it, and now I can paint in, and my layer underneath is just a red layer, so that's why it comes in looking like red blood, even though the color is white, right? And you can kind of come in there and paint that, paint a little too much, but you get the idea. So that way you can now manipulate. So you can start off with a smart mask, but then manipulate it by adding a paint layer. So once again, right click, you can add a paint layer, you can even add a generator over the top of it, you can add a filter over the top of it, on and on and on. So there's so many combinations of these things. This is really what I wanted to talk about. Now there is also a new mask editor within the Substance Painter 2. I'm not going to cover that because it gets real crazy. I do recommend that you look up the video that they show from Algorithm themselves, so learn a little bit more about the whole idea. But ultimately, I covered pretty much everything I wanted to cover, which is quite a bit, and you can see just really the power behind how layers and folders and masks work. So hopefully you've learned a lot. You can apply this to your pipeline. Now guys, I'll see you in the next video.